In 2005, in the small town of Dover, Pennsylvania, there was a trial that got worldwide attention. It was the first time that the proponents of the theory of evolution and the proponents of the theory of intelligent design would clash in a courtroom. Shortly after, PBS created a documentary called Judgment Day: Intelligent Design on Trial. In our commentary on that production, we shall examine some of what Nova showed you, and we will inform you about what they didn't show you. Why was the Kitzmiller Trial so important? Unlike the Scopes monkey trial, which was held in the 1920s, the Kitzmiller Trial was held in the 21st century, held in an era where scientists have at their disposal the greatest technology ever. It was an opportunity for the proponents of the theory of evolution to bring forth the most powerful evidence that they allegedly have for their beloved theory. It was anticipated that they would run circles around the proponents of the theory of intelligent design, but that was not what happened, as we will show in this commentary. The second reason the trial was important is the fact that the trial inspired the people at PBS and Nova to create a documentary called Judgment Day: Intelligent Design on Trial. But the most important thing that happened was that the trial created a permanent government document, the trial transcript. And unlike the spin that you got from the mainstream media, be it from the right or left, the transcript actually tells you what really happened there. And after the ID people and the creationists compared the trial transcript to the documentary, they came to realize that the transcript had just become one of the greatest tools for anti-Darwinian apologetics that has come along in a long time. For the transcript exposed the tactics used by Nova in an effort to dumb down the American people as to what actually happened at the trial. And the transcript also exposed the weaknesses of the theory of evolution, as we shall show. We will show how Nova's documentary was filled with misinformation, stereotyping, manipulation of trial dialogue, and most importantly, the omission of the cross-examination of the expert witnesses for the theory of evolution. In their documentary, Nova made no pretense that it was going to be a fair and balanced presentation. They devoted an entire half hour to the talking points of the theory of evolution, while intelligent design was allotted a mere 15 minutes. It is little wonder why groups like Fox News are running circles around these left-wing media types like PBS when it comes to ratings. Let's begin examining some of the portions of Nova's documentary entitled Judgment Day: Intelligent Design on Trial.
And in the DVD he got from the Discovery Institute, Buckingham found more support for intelligent design.
This claim that the DVD sent to Bill Buckingham was called Unlocking the Mysteries of Life is a claim that we have to believe is a deliberate lie. The reason we think so is because of what Paula Apsell, who headed the effort to create the documentary, had to say at a roundtable discussion at Southern Methodist University. Here's what she said.
And then the interesting thing was that we downloaded all of the transcripts of the trial. And we had to go through it and really decide, because drama is extremely expensive to shoot, and so we could only really do little snippets. And so we're sitting there, these piles of paper, and we had to go through it in minute detail, and we all kind of were sitting in our conference room day after day and trying to decide what pieces we should do.
So, Nova downloaded the trial transcripts, and they sat there day after day, going over it in minute detail. It is impossible to see how they found in the transcript Bill Buckingham testifying to the fact that it was unlocking the mysteries of life that was sent to him by the Discovery Institute when he testified to no such thing. Buckingham testifies to the fact that it was icons of evolution that was sent to him. He mentioned it twice. Another witness, Brian Ream, also testified to the fact that it was icons of evolution. He mentioned it 4 times in his testimony. And even Judge Jones in his decision mentioned that it was icons of evolution. So, in the trial, icons of evolution was mentioned at least 8 times, but Nova didn't mention it once in their documentary. And it is not difficult to ascertain why that was. Icons of Evolution was not about intelligent design. It was a critique of the theory of evolution. And since Nova has been in the tank for the theory of evolution for years, apparently they didn't want their viewers to know about the existence of Icons of Evolution. Icons of Evolution was created by Dr. Jonathan Wells, who has a PhD in molecular and cell biology. Kevin Padian and the NCSE are quite familiar with Dr. Wells, for they were refuted quite soundly by Dr. Wells in a work entitled Inherit the Spin. And since at least 4 members of the NCSE played significant roles in Nova's documentary, they apparently didn't want Dr. Wells to rain on their parade. Dr. Wells is a major player in the intelligent design movement, and yet Nova didn't mention his name once in the entire documentary. Let's move on to another segment of Nova's documentary.
Although most mainstream religions made peace with evolution decades ago,
it seems that Nova has a problem of keeping their facts straight. In another segment, they told us this.
to this day, somewhere between 1/3 and half the U.S. population does not accept evolution.
In fact, in 2012, Gallup released a poll that showed Americans are split down the middle over the teaching of evolution in public schools. And Gallup also showed that those who attended church on a regular basis accepted creationism by 70%. So, those who made so-called peace with evolution decades ago certainly are not represented in the majority, as Nova contends. Let's move on to another segment of Nova's documentary.
Intelligent design is a science stopper.
It makes people stupid.
That was Kenneth Miller and Kevin Padian, two experts for the theory of evolution. First, to Miller, we would suggest that what is a science stopper is what Nova did in their documentary when they avoided reenacting the cross-examinations for the witnesses for evolution, because to do so would expose the weaknesses of the theory and show the contradictions that abound in the Darwinian community. Another science stopper is what occurred in Washington State with a teacher named Roger DeHart. DeHart was censored from showing his students articles from prestigious science journals like Natural History and Nature because the articles cited some serious problems with evolution. Real science is not afraid to openly discuss problems with theories. Trying to stifle scientific inquiry is more of a practice found in the Darwinian community than it is amongst those who promote the theory of intelligent design. And to Mr. Padian, we would suggest that what makes people stupid is things like the promotion of fraudulent fossils in major museums in order to make people believe that birds evolved from dinosaurs. That was not done by the proponents of intelligent design, but was done by the prestigious National Geographic Society in their museum in Washington, D.C. This fossil fraud was put on display. It was pasted together by a lowly Chinese farmer and sold to the NGS for $80,000. What is really amazing is how this thing got by the so-called experts of the National Geographic Society in this age of technology. The National Geographic Society bills itself as the world's largest non-profit science and educational organization. Another thing that makes people stupid is to place Haeckel's fraudulent embryo drawings into textbooks to bolster the theory of evolution. The late Stephen Jay Gould, who was one of the most prominent proponents of the theory of evolution in the 20th century, commented about Haeckel's drawings. He said the following:
"We should not be surprised that Haeckel's drawings entered 19th century textbooks, but we do, I think, have the right to be both astonished and ashamed by the century of mindless recycling that has led to the persistence of these drawings in a large number, if not a majority, of modern textbooks."
We would find it amazing that anyone who listened to the testimony of the two witnesses for the theory of intelligent design, Minich and Behe, would come away with the impression that they were stupid men. Colleges and universities are not in the habit of handing out PhDs in microbiology to stupid people. Let's move on to another segment of Nova's documentary.
The goal of intelligent design is to try to re-Christianize American society.
The lack of logic here is rather stifling. In another segment, Nova had told us this:
But in the materials Buckingham received, God is never mentioned.
Not only is God not mentioned in the materials sent to Buckingham, but neither is Jesus Christ. So let's follow the logic of this genius from the NCSE. A teacher is going to use a textbook that doesn't mention God, doesn't mention Jesus Christ, and is somehow going to convert the students to Christianity? That indeed would be an amazing feat. And never mind the fact that members of the Discovery Institute include Jews and agnostics. And never mind the fact that there have been Jewish rabbis and clerics from the Nation of Islam who have also embraced the theory of intelligent design. Apparently, nobody warned them of this conspiracy to turn them into Christians. The fact of the matter is that those groups know that it has nothing to do with Christianity, but everything to do with science. One of the most prominent atheists of the 20th century, the late Antony Flew, had this to say about intelligent design.
The argument to intelligent design is enormously stronger than it was when I first met it. The findings of more than 50 years of DNA research have provided materials for a new and enormously powerful argument to design.
Professor Flew realized that the origin of life, with the amazing complex information system of DNA, couldn't be explained by materialistic evolution and only make sense if there was some kind of intelligence behind it. Flew also didn't think that anybody would be able to explain how the first self-replicating organism was able to come up with a mechanism to pass along information to its descendants and to do it in one lifetime. And since evolutionary theory requires gradual changes, taking thousands and millions of years to accomplish those changes, let's move on to another segment of Nova's documentary.
The reporters in the courtroom were just amazed that we knew all this stuff, and how come they hadn't learned about this stuff before? And the reason is, it's not in textbooks because the creationists fight so hard to keep it out. That's been a big influence.
This is demonstrably false. For example, the introduction of Piltdown Man came in 1913 and hung around in textbooks until 1953, when it was discovered to be a fraud. Even Nova, on one of their websites, informed us that entire careers were built on Piltdown Man's authenticity. Earlier, we had mentioned how Stephen Jay Gould had pointed out that Haeckel's fraudulent embryo drawings were recycled for over a century in textbooks. Many people are familiar with the photos of peppered moths on the trunks of trees in biology textbooks, but few, if any, teachers ever told their students that the photos were staged, for studies showed that peppered moths don't rest on tree trunks, but rather up underneath the branches. If creationists had the kind of influence Mr. Padian contends they do to keep things out of textbooks, those frauds would have never seen the light of day in textbooks. The reality is that the only reason those frauds remained in textbooks for as long as they did is because of the Darwinian influences in the public school system and in the scientific community. Let's move on to another segment of Nova's documentary.
And then he starts to say, well, have you read this book, Dr. Behe? And he starts to pile these up on Behe's witness stand. Eventually, Behe was almost dwarfed by the stack of scientific literature on the evolutionary origin of the immune system.
All these hard-working scientists published article after article over years and years, chapters and books, full books, addressing the question of how the vertebrate immune system evolved. But none of them are satisfactory to you.
That's a lawyer's trick. Purely a lawyer's trick. Now, was Michael Behe going to read every one of those books before he responded?
The intellectual dishonesty engaged by Nova here was appalling. They tried to make Michael Behe look like he was flustered and befuddled and didn't have an answer for the question being asked of him. Mr. Thompson had the opportunity here to point out that Michael Behe responded to that question, and Thompson should have asked why Nova didn't allow the actor to reenact that testimony at that point in the documentary. Perhaps Mr. Thompson tried, but maybe Nova didn't allow him to. But anyway, here is what Behe responded with immediately after he was asked the question, which Nova did not reenact.
Well, see, that again is an example of confusing the different meanings of evolution. As we have seen before, evolution means a number of things, such as change over time, common descent, gradualism, and so on. And when I say Darwinian evolution, that is focusing exactly on the mechanism of natural selection. And none of these articles address that.
We suspect the reason that they had to change the subject at that point in the trial is because of what NCSE member Nick Matsky pointed out in the documentary.
The last time any lawyer took biology was probably in 9th grade, and I spent months and months on email at meetings explaining science, explaining evolution to the lawyers.
No matter how much time he spent with the lawyers, there was no way he was going to teach them enough in order that they might be able to debate this issue with a man with a PhD in that area of expertise. One of the rules of good lawyers when cross-examining a witness is that you shouldn't ask a question that you don't already know the answer to. Mr. Thompson also had the opportunity to point out that during the rest of the trial, not a single expert witness for the theory of evolution even made the attempt to open one of those books or articles to point out where Michael Behe was wrong. They had all the time in the world to prepare for that portion of the trial and should have continued in the effort to refute Michael Behe's contention of what was not in any of those books or articles. Surely Mr. Thompson had read Judge Jones' written decision and could have also pointed out that this part of the trial demonstrated that Judge Jones was not paying very close attention to Michael Behe's testimony. For in his written decision, he claimed that Michael Behe had said that the books and articles were not good enough. But the trial transcript shows that Michael Behe said no such thing. In fact, he said just the opposite. Behe's actual words were,
"So it's not that they aren't good enough. It's simply that they are addressed to a different subject."
You would think that a judge that was going to ridicule something someone said in his courtroom would at least check the trial transcript to be sure he was accurate. Judge Jones obviously did not do that. In fact, you can go to one of the Discovery Institute's websites and find an entire list of things that the judge got wrong in his decision. In another segment of Nova's documentary, they once again engaged in intellectual dishonesty by cutting off Michael Behe's complete answer. Observe.
But you are clear. Under your definition, the definition that sweeps in intelligent design, astrology is also a scientific theory.
Yes, that's correct.
They wanted to make you believe that all Behe said at that point was, "Yes, that's correct," and nothing more. But the trial transcript again showed that Behe went on to deflate what the attorney had tried to do. He tried to make it appear as if Behe believed that astrology was a valid scientific theory, when in fact, Behe did not. Let's move on to another segment of Nova's documentary.
And where the Pandas book says we can't go from A to B, there are no fossils and we don't know how to study them. Actually, we've gone from A to B and to C, D, E, F, and G. We have the fossils, we have the transitional features, we have the ways of analyzing them with many different lines of evidence, and we're looking for the picture that accounts for the most lines of objective evidence.
You should have noticed that Mr. Padian doesn't mention any of the alleged species that he claims to have transitional forms for. He just makes the assertion that he does, and apparently we are supposed to take his word for it. Let us tell you a dirty little secret about such alleged transitional sequences. In 1999, paleontologist and senior editor for the prestigious journal Nature, Dr. Henry G., had this to say.
No fossil is buried with its birth certificate. To take a line of fossils and claim that they represent a lineage is not a scientific hypothesis that can be tested, but an assertion that carries the same validity as a bedtime story, amusing, perhaps even instructive, but not scientific.
Mr. Padian was fully aware that Dr. G had such views, for he had even written about some of Dr. G's writings in a work entitled "What the Media Don't Tell You About Evolution." It seems quite hypocritical to us that Padian and the rest of the crew at the NCSE have no problem seeing their unscientific hypotheses appear in textbooks and science journals, but oppose the views of intelligent design to be permitted in these same textbooks and journals on the grounds that intelligent design is not scientific. Let's move on to another segment of Nova's documentary.
My testimony in the trial was basically taking a day and showing the judge how we do our work and what the evidence is.
How dinosaurs evolved into birds, as seen in creatures like Archaeopteryx, which has a long tail and teeth like a dinosaur, but feathers just like a modern bird.
We would suggest that Nova check with Dr. Alan Fiducia, who is a paleoornithologist specializing in the origins and phylogeny of birds. He seems to have a conflicting view of what Nova said here.
Paleontologists have tried to turn Archaeopteryx into an earthbound feathered dinosaur, but it's not. It is a bird, a perching bird, and no amount of paleobabble is going to change that.
And in a work entitled Accommodating the Cladogram, which appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Dr. Fiducia wrote the following.
Despite the popularity of the dinosaurian origin of birds, many ornithologists and physiologists in particular have tremendous difficulty with the theory because of a huge and growing body of contrary evidence and the fact that a ground-up origin of avian flight is considered a near biophysical impossibility. Aside from criticism concerning the cursorial origin of avian flight, there are problems related to the geological, temporal occurrence of putative dinosaurian ancestors, which occurs some 30 to 80 million years after the appearance of the earliest known bird. And these forms become more and more superficially bird-like as one approaches the latest Cretaceous. There's also the fact that virtually all of the anatomical features used to ally birds and dinosaurs have been disputed.
Let's move on to another segment of Nova's documentary.
So how can scientists be so sure Darwin's tree accurately represents the history of life on Earth? As it turned out, the latest in a large body of evidence to refute intelligent design and support evolution was coming to light just as this case was unfolding. Shubin and his colleagues organized an expedition to one of the most desolate places on Earth, the Canadian Arctic, about 500 miles from the North Pole, where rocks of just the right age are exposed. Here, they hope to fill a gap in the branch of the evolutionary tree that leads from primitive fish to animals with 4 limbs, or tetrapods, by finding a fossil of an animal that shared characteristics of both. But after 3 summers of digging through hundreds of tons of rock in this harsh environment, they had found little of interest. They returned the next year for one last try.
Money was running out. This was it. We were told this was our last year up there. And then in 2004, in the 3rd day of the season, a colleague of mine was removing rock and discovered a little snout sticking out the side of the cliff, just like exactly like this. And he removed more rock and more rock and more rock, and it became clear this was a snout of a flat-headed animal. And that's when we knew, flat-headed animal at 375 million years old, this is going to be something interesting.
They called it Tiktaalik, which means large freshwater fish in the language of the local Inuit people. And it's one of the most vivid transitional fossils ever discovered, showing how land animals evolved from primitive fish.
This portion of Nova's documentary was one of the most telling, though many might not realize it, for Tiktaalik was never mentioned in that actual trial. Why was that so telling? Well, think about it. You have this huge trial that the scientific world is watching, and surely Padian and the rest would have been aware of that. And Padian would have surely brought to the trial the very best evidence for transitional forms that he could muster to impress the judge and the world. But whatever Padian brought to impress the judge and the world, it was not Tiktaalik. And whatever it was so impressive that Nova couldn't use it in their documentary to impress its viewers. Amazingly enough, Nova, in the entire documentary, did not show a single fossil sequence that was talked about in the actual trial. So, Nova instead had to manufacture this slick Hollywood-style mini melodrama of a last-ditch effort to find something, because the money was running out. And wouldn't you know it, they found something. Imagine that. As for the allegation that Tiktaalik was a precursor to tetrapods, that was refuted in 2010 with the finding of tetrapod tracks in Zakami, Poland that predated Tiktaalik by 10 million years. So, the alleged evolutionary tree that Nova kept showing us was wrong again. One might ask, why didn't Kevin Padian show us that series of transitional forms that he had bragged about earlier?
And where the pandas book says we can't go from A to B, there are no fossils and we don't know how to study them. Actually, we've gone from A to B and to C, D, E, F, and G. We have the fossils, we have the transitional features.
If that is true, why didn't he show it to us here? Surely that would have been impressive, would it not? This would be a good time to say something about that alleged evolutionary tree of life. World-famous anthropologist, the late Mary Leakey, had this to say to the Associated Press shortly before she died.
All those trees of life with their branches of our ancestors, that's a lot of nonsense.
The late Stephen Jay Gould, who many in the United States considered to be America's unofficial laureate in the field of evolution, had this to say.
The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, not the evidence of fossils.
It should be noted that this quote was shown to Kevin Padian at his cross-examination, which of course Nova didn't show us. Padian responded with the claim that Gould didn't know what he was talking about. Padian said that Gould's knowledge wasn't perfect. But anybody who has followed Gould would find it rather hard to believe that a man of his prominence in the Darwinian community would not be aware of some new evidence that surely would have made news when it was found. Interestingly enough, Kevin Padian once defended Stephen Jay Gould against an attack in New Yorker magazine. On that occasion, Padian said something to the effect that no one taught America more about evolution than Gould. And Harvard University's Richard Lewontin also had something to say about fossils in his work entitled Human Diversity. He said the following.
Look, I'm a person who says in this book that we don't know anything about the ancestors of the human species. All the fossils, which have been dug up, and are claimed to be ancestors, we haven't the faintest idea whether they are ancestors. All you've got is Homo sapiens there, you've got that fossil there, You've got another fossil there, and it's up to you to draw the lines. Because there are no lines.
And of course, there was Dr. Henry G. of Nature, who had this to say about so-called missing links being found. He said, and I quote, "It is as if the chain of ancestry and descent were a real object for our contemplation, and not what it really is, a completely human invention created after the fact, shaped to accord with human prejudices." Let's move on to another segment of Nova's documentary.
With each fossil, Padian refuted Panda's claim that different life forms appear suddenly by showing how fossils of extinct organisms bridge the gaps between species, resulting in a picture of gradual evolution, just as Darwin proposed.
This alleged gradualistic account was also contradicted in the trial during the cross-examination of Kevin Padian, which again, Nova didn't show us either. There, Kevin Padian was shown two quotes from prominent proponents of evolution, Robert Carroll and Ernst Mayr, who refuted the gradualistic account. Padian said he disagreed with Carroll in detail, and Padian also claimed that Mayr didn't know beans about fossils. It should also be pointed out here that Stephen Jay Gould had also written about this subject, where he said the following.
Contrary to Darwin's expectation, that new data would reveal gradualistic continuity, with slow and steady expansion. All major discoveries of the past century have only heightened the massiveness and geological abruptness of this formative event. The fossil record had caused Darwin more grief than joy. Nothing distressed him more than the Cambrian explosion.
So, this claim that Padian had refuted Panda's book is highly disputable. Let's move on to another segment of Nova's documentary.
As an example of what irreducible complexity means, advocates of intelligent design like to point to a very common machine, the mousetrap. And the mousetrap is composed of 5 parts. It has a base plate, the catch, a spring, a little hammer that actually does the dirty work, and a bait holder. The mousetrap will not work if any one of these 5 parts are taken away. That's absolutely true. But remember the key notion of irreducible complexity, and that is that this whole machine is completely useless until all the parts are in place. Well, that turns out not to be true. And I'll give you an example. What I have right here is a mousetrap from which I've removed 2 of the 5 parts. I still have the base plate, the spring, and the hammer. Now, you can't catch any mice with this, so it's not a very good mousetrap. But it turns out that despite the missing parts, it makes a perfectly good, if somewhat inelegant, tie clip.
This analogy is flawed, in that Miller is using an inanimate object that was intelligently designed and manipulated at each step of the manufacturing process. In real-life scenarios, organisms are alleged to evolve randomly with no intelligent guidance whatsoever. Secondly, Miller started out with a complete mousetrap and intelligently removed 2 parts from it to make his tie clasp. In real-life scenarios, if you take away 2 critical parts of a living thing, what remains is a dead creature that is not going to have a function of any kind other than to be food for the worms, beetles, flies, and ants. In another segment, Nova let Brian Ream, a teacher who opposed the introduction of intelligent design, tell some of his experiences when Mr. Ream was out campaigning for one of the offices of the Board of Education. He told of being called a lot of vulgar names and even being called an atheist, and Nova followed it up with this.
Every step I take, I take in you. You walk my way, Jesus. Every breath I take.
For the Reams, this was particularly hurtful. Both are active in their church and run a summer Bible school program.
From the Christian perspective, one has to wonder if the Reams had the same kind of zeal to enter into the battle of removing the religion of secular humanism from the public school system. For in a documentary about teachers allegedly trying to promote religion in science classrooms, you would think the Reams would say something about the promotion of secular humanism in classrooms too. In the Torcaso versus Watkins case, the Supreme Court stated that secular humanism was a religion. We could show you dozens of quotes from secular humanists that confirm that belief. And secular humanists like John J. Dunphy have made it quite clear what they envision for the public school system in regards to promoting it there.
The classroom must and will become an arena of conflict between the old and the new, the rotting corpse of Christianity, together with all of its adjacent evils and misery, and the new faith of humanism.
Charles Francis Potter, an original signer of the Humanist Manifesto and an honorary president of the National Education Association, had this to say about public school education.
Education is a most powerful ally of humanism, and every American public school is a school of humanism.
The January-February 1983 issue of The Humanist carried an article entitled "Religion for a New Age," in which the author stated the following.
I am convinced that the battle for humankind's future must be waged and won in the public school classroom by teachers who correctly perceive their role as the proselytizers of a new faith, a religion of humanity. These teachers must embody the same selfless dedication as the most rabid fundamentalist preachers, for they will be ministers of another sort, utilizing a classroom instead of a pulpit to convey humanist values. Regardless of the educational level, preschool, daycare, or a large state university.
Other secular humanists, like Tom Flynn from the Council for Secular Humanism, even openly brags about how the process of secularizing the public schools is about a third done. That was revealed in a work entitled Requiem for a Juggernaut. Secular humanist attorney Leo Pfeiffer, who was involved in the Torcaso case in the Humanist September-October 1988 issue, revealed a fear that if the Supreme Court upholds its current understanding of religion to include secular humanism and orders the teachings of humanism to be removed from the public schools, Pfeiffer felt, and I quote, "The consequences may be no less than the disintegration of our public school system and the end of Horace Mann's dream." We have seen activist teachers like Steve Kukovich in Vacaville, California, punish students for saying "God bless you" when a classmate sneezed.
A teacher in Northern California doesn't want to hear a common courtesy in his classroom. He's even lowering students' grades if they say "bless you" after someone sneezes. He just thinks it's outdated and disrupts class time.
In the old days, they thought you were dispelling evil spirits out of your body. So they were saying, "God bless you," for getting rid of the evil spirits. But today I said, really what you're doing doesn't make any sense anymore.
This is a prime example of a teacher imposing his secular worldview on his students, which no teacher has the right to do. No teacher has the right to criticize the faith of his students, no matter how archaic he may think the faith is. Students have been saying "God bless you" for centuries. In fact, in the 1950s, there were a higher percentage of students who said "God bless you" than there are today. And yet, the level of public school education was world-class back then, second to none. But today, with idealists like Kukovich, our students are doing a lot poorer in tests than they did back then. So this idea that saying God bless you is going to diminish the student's ability to learn is a joke. This kind of activism by teachers is a lot more serious problem for Christians than the introduction of an intelligent design book in the library. And if the Reams don't think so, then there is a verse in the Bible that will fit them quite nicely. You strain out a fly and swallow a camel. Let's move on to another segment of Nova's documentary.
Darwin reasoned that in nature, individual organisms compete for limited resources, like food. If, for example, a bird is born with a slightly larger beak than the other members of the population, that might give it an advantage on an island where large seeds are more common. Over many generations, birds with large beaks would be more likely to survive and reproduce, handing down this advantageous beak shape to greater numbers of offspring than those with smaller beaks.
Darwin's finches are a part of a standard argument made by the proponents of the theory of evolution that allegedly shows evolution at work. But that is not the case. It is instead merely an example of how species can change slightly within species boundaries. The large-beaked finches are still finches. Speciation has not occurred. Peter Grant and his wife have studied Darwin's finches for years, and they have reported that the larger-beaked finches have been able to successfully interbreed with the smaller-beaked finches without hybridization having occurred. Normally, when you try to cross one species with another, you get a sterile hybrid. For instance, if you cross a horse with a donkey, you get a mule that is sterile. The Grants have also reported that when the long periods of drought ended and the long rainy periods returned, so did the smaller beaked finches, and they dominated. If evolution were true, that should not have occurred, because the larger beaks would be just as much an advantage in rainy periods as in drought periods, and the larger beaked finches would still be passing on the traits and would still be dominant. Let's move on to another segment of Nova's documentary.
In an era where we're trying to cure cancer, where we're trying to prevent pandemics, where we're trying to keep science and math education on the cutting edge in the United States, to introduce and teach bad science to 9th grade students makes very little sense to me.
The very idea that the United States is trying to keep our students on the cutting edge of education is a joke.
American high school kids are beaten on the international tests, not just by kids from Belgium, but by kids from most countries, even poorer ones like Poland, the Czech Republic, South Korea.
The fact of the matter is, since the creation of the Department of Education, we have seen a public school system that was second to none in the 1950s to one that today sees our students testing 17th in the world of science and 25th in math.
Unfortunately, I'm rather pessimistic about the way we teach science. And some people ask me a simple question. They're visitors from overseas, and they say that, wow, America has so many Nobel laureates, but it has one of the worst educational programs known to science. This is measurable. Our kids score dead last among all the other developed nations. And our students actually rank a little bit below the students of Jordan in science and math tests.
CBS recently reported that in New York City, 80% of the public school graduates don't have the basic skills when they try to enter city universities and need remedial classes. Similar results have been reported in places like Detroit, Los Angeles, and even the nation's capital. New York spends more money per student than most states in the country, yet this is the result. It is that same ideology that has our students testing so poorly in math that is also indoctrinating our students in science classes with the pseudoscience of Darwinism. We are not teaching our children what they should know in these critical areas, and as a result, our children can't compete for the best jobs when they go up against foreign students. We would submit to the judge that it is the left-wing educational philosophies that he supports that are holding our children back. All across the country, states are eliminating or drastically cutting back on gifted child programs. And so our brightest can't move along at the pace they should be able to in order to compete in the world economy. So for this judge to defend the current educational system as if it were doing a good job reveals his ignorance in more than just one area of concern. And this is the guy they gave the job to decide whether intelligent design is scientific or not? One would think they would have picked a judge with expertise in dealing with highly scientifically charged cases. Yet even Nova told us about his shortcomings in that area.
To make their case before a judge who had no particular scientific training, the lawyers for the parents assembled a team of expert witnesses.
Let's move on to another segment of Nova's documentary.
The fight culminated in 1987, when the Supreme Court decided that teaching creationism in public school science classes violated the separation of church and state, mandated by the Constitution in the Establishment Clause, which prevents the government from promoting or prohibiting any form of religion.
Any form of religion? As we showed earlier, it was the Supreme Court itself that categorized secular humanism as being a religion. And yet, they operate on a double standard by not removing secular humanism from the public educational system. Let's move on to another segment of Nova's documentary.
Their legal battles stretch back to the famous Scopes monkey trial of 1925.
Now, as I told you yesterday, Darwin's theory tells us that man evolved from a lower order of animals.
In that case, a high school science teacher in Tennessee named John Scopes was accused of violating state law by teaching evolution.
I hereby place you under arrest.
It is not surprising that Hollywood would present revisionist history, but you would think that an organization like Nova would be better informed. First of all, John Scopes was not a science teacher. He had a law degree from the University of Kentucky, and he was hired to coach the football team and to teach math. Occasionally, he substituted for absent teachers, and to his dying day, he stated that he never taught evolution in the classroom. Even PBS, on one of its sites, informed us that Scopes couldn't remember teaching evolution, but he did believe in it and went along with the lawyers. Let's move on to another segment of Nova's documentary.
To make the case for intelligent design, the defense had lined up 8 expert witnesses, including several members of the Discovery Institute, the Seattle organization that promotes intelligent design. But of those 8 witnesses, 5 never testified.
Witnesses started dropping like flies.
Here, Nova plays this ominous-sounding music and tries to give the impression that the Discovery Institute witnesses that didn't appear in the trial were allegedly afraid to do so. It is a fact that NCSE member Barbara Forrest went around promoting the idea that they were probably afraid to appear because, as she put it, Armed with her work, any decent attorney would make mincemeat of them. But the fact of the matter is that the witnesses didn't appear because they had consulted other attorneys, and that the Thomas More Law Center, who was defending the case, felt it was going to be a conflict of interest, and so they in effect fired the witnesses. Forrest also claimed that Discovery Institute's David DeWolf was nowhere in sight when he had the opportunity to defend intelligent design in court. But the fact of the matter is that DeWolf submitted over 80 pages of amicus briefs to Judge Jones. It would not have been a difficult thing for Nova to find that out, for the trial records are a matter of public record. But of course, they weren't motivated enough to do that, for it was their intent to present anything having to do with intelligent design in a negative fashion. At this time, we are going to cover some of the key cross-examination testimony of the expert witnesses for the theory of evolution, none of which was reenacted by Nova, and it should become obvious why they didn't. In the cross-examination of Kenneth Miller, he was asked if he knew who Francis Crick was. Miller said that he did. Francis Crick was a Nobel Prize-winning scientist who had advanced the idea that life on Earth might have started as a result of aliens seeding the planet with life forms. Miller was asked if he considered Crick's theory to be a scientific theory. Miller acknowledged that it was. Miller was then asked if, in his opinion, Crick's theory required any supernatural intervention. Miller conceded that it did not require any kind of supernatural intervention. So, the point was made that Crick's theory was a scientific theory, involved intelligent design, and did not require the intervention of a supernatural source. Miller was then asked if he was familiar with NASA's SETI project, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Miller acknowledged that he was aware of that project also. Again, Miller was asked if he thought that it was a scientific project. And again, Miller acknowledged that it was. And then Miller was asked if NASA was looking for any supernatural involvement in their project. And again, Miller said, no, they were not. So once again, it was pointed out that the SETI project was a scientific one, involved the theory of intelligent design, and did not require any supernatural involvement. This portion of the trial was key to the defense's assertion that the intelligent design theory was scientific and did not require any supernatural involvement. But Nova ignored that portion of the trial, even though it was short and wouldn't require much time to reenact. And apparently, Judge Jones also didn't think much of it. In fact, Judge Jones, in his 139-page decision, did not mention any of the cross-examination testimony of the expert witnesses for the theory of evolution either, which is quite telling in itself. In another portion of the cross-examination of Kenneth Miller, it was also shown that he was in contradiction with another very prominent proponent of evolution, the late George Gaylord Simpson, who had stated that evolution was a random process. Miller claimed that it was not. Then it was shown that Miller's testimony about evolution not being random was even in conflict with what appeared in Miller's own biology textbook. Miller tried to explain that away by throwing his co-author Joe Levine under the bus and claiming that it was a mistake put into the textbook by Levine. And Miller claimed that the mistake only appeared once in the third edition of that textbook and nowhere else. But research by Casey Luskin of the Discovery Institute shows that the claim for the randomness of evolution was also found in the first, second, and fourth editions of the same textbook. One of the most instructive statements made in the trial was made by Kenneth Miller when he was being cross-examined. And if you didn't read the trial transcript, you would have probably never heard of it up to now. It gave a true understanding of where the theory of evolution actually stands, contrary to what you have been led to believe by the mainstream news media, the public education system, judges like Jones, and the Darwinist community. Miller was asked this question:
Is it true that scientists do not know enough about all structures in the cell? Or to describe how they all work? Or describe how evolution could have produced each of them by step-by-step processes?
Miller responded with this:
We don't really have an understanding of how such molecules could have gathered together, pulled together the other structures that they need, and to produce a living cell as we understand it today. So we will have to have an absolute and complete and total understanding of how everything in the cell works before we can even begin to put together an understanding of how it evolved.
So, what Miller actually told us was that after 150 years of study since Darwin proposed his theory, science can't even tell us how the living cell evolved. And yet, they want us to believe that they know something about how more complex structures than the living cell evolved? That is comparable to one saying, "I can't tell you how to build a bicycle, but I can tell you how to build a fully functional 747. So, all the alleged preponderance of evidence that Darwinists claim they have for the theory of evolution is nothing more than vacuous rhetoric. Let's move on to another segment of Nova's documentary.
Creationists like Bonsell reject much of modern science in favor of a literal reading of the Bible.
To say that this was a stereotype and a gross exaggeration would be putting it mildly. Consider this statement by Harvard University's Richard Lewontin.
We take the side of science, in spite of some of its absurd constructs, in spite of the scientific community's tolerance for unsubstantiated just-so stories. We have a priori commitment, a commitment to materialism.
It is those absurd constructs promoted in the name of modern science, and those just-so stories told in the name of modern science, that are the kind of things people like Alan Bonsell reject. Just to give you an idea of what we are talking about in that regard, just listen to the YouTube video that was created by Richard Dawkins called "Dawkins Makes an Eye."
I want to see if I can design an eye using those principles from scratch, a bare patch of skin. Skin cells like these often have a little light-sensitive pigment to start with.
To say that you are starting from scratch using a light-sensitive patch of skin is an absurdity of gross proportions. The fact of the matter is that even a simple light-sensitive spot is extremely complicated, involving a huge number of specialized proteins and protein systems. These proteins and protein systems are integrated in such a way that if one were removed, vision would cease. In other words, for the miracle of vision to occur, even for a light-sensitive spot, a great many of proteins and protein systems would have to evolve simultaneously because without them there all at once, vision would not occur. Of course, nowhere in this tale of Dawkins does he tell you how these complicated protein systems developed. He just starts out with them already there. How convenient for him.
Skin cells like these often have a little light-sensitive pigment to start with, so something interesting can happen. Of course, these cells couldn't possibly tell an animal where the light was coming from. All light would illuminate them equally, so they'd just be on or off. But let's drop our cells slightly into a shallow pit. Things begin to get better. Now our hypothetical animal could steer by light. If the angles are wide enough apart, different patches of cells will be exposed to light from different angles.
Trying to figure out which direction the light was coming from would be the least of the animal's problems. Did you see or hear any mention of the optic nerve being present at this point of development? No, you didn't. And the fact of the matter is that without the presence of the optic nerve, the animal would not even know if there was any light at all. Within the retina, there is a complex system of rod and cone cells, bipolar cells, ganglion cells, all working together to translate light into nerve impulses that are then sent to the brain via optic nerve at lightning speeds so that the creature can react. Did you see or hear Dawkins explain how that very complex series of cells developed? No, you didn't. Did you see or hear Dawkins explain how the three separate layers of the eye develop? The sclera, the choroid, and the retina. You didn't see him explain how those three separate layers develop, did you? Of course not. Did you see or hear Dawkins tell you how the blood vessels that feed the eye developed? No, you didn't. You see, storytellers like Dawkins want you to believe that the development of those extremely complex systems within the structure of the eye need not be explained. He wants you to believe that somehow they just appeared and started working. And this is true of all Darwinian storytellers, like this tale of Dawkins. They always give you just a summary of the step-by-step process, but never get into the details of the development of each step. And that is because they know nothing about the details of that very complex development. And we should be asking ourselves, if these are the kinds of stories being told by one of the leading proponents of evolution in the world today, what kinds of even more absurd stories are being told by Darwinists of lesser stature than Dawkins? Not only are Darwinists like Dawkins very imaginative when concocting such simplistic demonstrations as in Dawkins makes an eye, but it is also not beneath them to fabricate things that can be demonstrably proven to be wrong by any high school freshman. For instance, in Dawkins' book, River Out of Eden, Dawkins informs us of the following, and I quote, "This ratio is called Matheson's ratio. Nilsson and Pelger's computer model homed in unerringly on Matheson's ratio," unquote. This was in relation to a work on eye evolution by Nilsson and Pelger. Apparently, Dawkins wanted to take advantage of the fact that many people are impressed with computer simulations. The sad reality is that Nilsson and Pelger's work contained no mention of a computer simulation model at all. Dawkins just grabbed it out of the air. So, people like Alan Bonsell, who have critical thinking skills, know that these kinds of just-so stories are out there and are being promoted in the name of modern science. And it is people like Alan Bonsell who have tried to inform parents about it, although sometimes making mistakes in the way he went about it. People like Alan Bonsell have no problem with operational science, the kind that does tests and can actually see the results of such tests. Let's move on to another segment of Nova's documentary.
Both defendants and many of the leading proponents of intelligent design make a bedrock assumption which is utterly false. Their presupposition is that evolutionary theory is antithetical to a belief in the existence of a supreme being and to religion in general.
In this portion of the judge's decision, he exposed himself for the activist judge that he was in this case. And we would highly suggest that he listen to some of his own speeches, like this one.
Within other criticisms directed at my opinion, time and again the writers would omit to note the role that legal precedent has and that it plays in the way that we decide cases as judges. And what I mean by that is that I have to follow the law as previously established by the higher courts and in particular by the Supreme Court of the United States.
If he is so concerned about Supreme Court precedents, he should have paid more attention to what was said in the U.S. versus Ballard. Justice Douglas made it quite clear that it is not the role of the judge to make pronouncements concerning the question of whether or not someone's faith is true or utterly false. It was made clear in Ballard that because of the First Amendment, no one can ever be tried for heresy in our court system. This statement of Judge Jones drew negative reactions from legal scholars like Jay Wexler of Boston University.
The part of Kitzmiller that finds intelligent design not to be science is unnecessary, unconvincing, not particularly suited to the judicial role, and even perhaps dangerous both to science and to freedom of religion.
In conclusion, we will say this about the documentary entitled Judgment Day: Intelligent Design on Trial. The technical aspects of its production, such as camera work, acting out reenactments, and the creation of the soundtrack, were all very well done, as many of today's Hollywood documentaries are. However, the cowardice of Nova was exemplified by its use of intellectual dishonesty, misinformation, and the omissions of key testimony involving the cross-examination of the expert witnesses for evolution, which exposed the documentary for what it was: a propaganda piece for Darwinism. Further evidence of this cowardice was shown in a roundtable discussion at Southern Methodist University dealing with the making of the documentary. Judge Jones was there, left-wing reporter Lori Lebo, who covered the trial, was there, Eric Rothschild, one of the attorneys who sued the Dover School Board, was there. But who you did not see there was any members of the Discovery Institute who were witnesses in the trial, none of the defense team. In fact, not a single proponent of intelligent design was there to comment on the documentary or about the trial. As for the Kitzmiller trial itself, it was a foregone conclusion as to how the decision would come down. Judge Jones was an activist judge, as we have shown. Additionally, he has been cozying up to secular humanists. For example, he accepted an award at the World Humanist Congress in 2008 and has been giving speeches at other events sponsored by local secular humanist organizations, like the one in 2009 in Santa Barbara, California. And considering how militantly hostile are the secular humanist views of Christianity, It seems rather strange that Jones would be cozying up to them, since he claims to be a Christian. And some of the things he has said in his speeches has disturbed many Christians. He actually had the gall to say the following in front of a gathering of Lutherans at the Mount Airy School of Religion in 2006.
And the founders, it's pretty clear, believed that true religion was not something handed down by a church or contained in the Bible, but that it was to be found through free, rational inquiry.
It is highly unlikely that it would sit well with the Lutheran Church to be accused of not handling true religion, and that true religion could not be found in the Bible that they preach from. In another speech, Jones again tried to associate religion with negativity by quoting Alexander Hamilton out of context. But the reality is that Hamilton's view of religion contained no such negativity. In fact, he stated the following, and I quote, "I have carefully examined the evidences of the Christian religion, and if I was sitting as a juror upon its authenticity, I would unhesitatingly give my verdict in its favor. I can prove its truth by any proposition ever submitted to the mind of man." And as he lay dying, among his last words were, and I quote, "I have a tender reliance on the mercy of the Almighty through the merits of the Lord Jesus Christ. I am a sinner. I look to Him for mercy. Pray for me." And as we showed before, it is apparent that the judge is very selective as to which precedences he accepts and which he rejects. He obviously accepted the precedents that allowed him to find in favor of the plaintiffs, that being the Establishment Clause of the Constitution. And since it had been proven that the board had non-secular motivations in trying to introduce the Book of Pandas and People into the school curriculum, it was an easy decision for Jones to follow precedences that declared those actions to be unconstitutional. But it is those precedences that are the root of the problem. They are based on false interpretation of the Founding Fathers' intent. The Founding Fathers knew of no such wall of separation between church and state, as interpreted by today's demagogues in the court. It was the Founding Fathers who wrote the Constitution, and in the same week that they established the First Amendment, they also hired chaplains who went on to hold religious services in both houses of Congress on a regular basis. The salaries of the chaplains were paid with public funds. It doesn't make any sense that the men who were brilliant enough to draw up that fabulous document that we call the Constitution then turned around and did things that are unconstitutional. It only makes sense when we come to realize that their view of separation of church and state was quite different than the view being promoted by today's demagogues. And anybody who thinks the Supreme Court is some kind of august body free of bias and incapable of making mistakes doesn't know much about the history of the court. One need only look at the Dred Scott case to see that they were wrong then, and on the issue of separation of church and state, they are wrong now. And as far as Judge Jones, delving into the question of whether or not intelligent design is a science or not, it is obvious that his written decision shows that either he didn't understand the argument of the proponents of intelligent design, or that he just chose to go along with the current consensus to hide that fact. It was the safe play to say, "Hey, most of the experts agree with me." Thus, he was guilty of accepting the fallacy in which philosophical disciplines is called the fallacy of consensus gentium, arguing that an idea is true on the basis that the majority of the people believe it. That it is indeed a fallacy has been proven time and time again by every new major discovery in science. Each discovery that changed the consensus exposed the errors that the consensus previously held. So it is apparent that John E. Jones III has chosen to side with the secular humanist influences and has decided to be content with being ignorant of the facts, and has chosen to ignore the reality that in Darwinism, the devil is in the details.